So, the next session, which is the second last session that we will have today, before the closing, has a very challenging title, or kind of, you could say, this is what we're looking for, bringing it all together, addressing environment in protracted crisis setting. Allow me to introduce the moderator for this distinguished panel that you can see in front of you. So, Richard Piercehouse, he's a researcher, and he comes from Human Rights Watch in Switzerland. And he's a senior researcher on environmental issues at Human Rights Watch, and he focuses on environmental health in his current work. He has researched and written numerous reports for Human Rights Watch, and the most recent one is from Thailand and Bangladesh. He's a lawyer of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, Australia. Richard, I hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leif. The session that we will have now is titled Bringing It All Together. When I asked the organisers what they wanted to cover in this session, the answer was literally, quote, a little bit of everything, end quote. And my hope is that we've been talking in the last 2 days over how nature is often an afterthought in conflict, crises and displacement settings, with the driving immediate imperative to save lives, to focus on improving security, and all of the logistics that accompanies that sometimes nature and environmental concerns are put into the second row of considerations. As one person put it to me, that prioritization process is understandable but not optimal. The focus of this session, and it's a great pleasant change for me as a human rights worker to be presenting some of the good news. The focus of this session is to talk about practical examples of how organisations have been able to reverse that prioritization, that natural inclination. My hope is that the session will be a wide roaming one, focusing, as the previous session did, on developing resilience and self-reliance of affected communities, talking about the specifics of addressing energy needs with a focus often on programmatic interventions focusing on vulnerable groups. My hope is that we'll be able to talk about some of the issues we've been talking about around environmental management systems, about greening the blue, and running through it all, a theme whereby short-term solutions, when they become long-term solutions, can anticipate environmental concerns. So your panelists this morning will discuss and share experiences of integrating environmental considerations in programming in crisis and displacement settings. And I'd also, moving forward, identify some of the key topics and issues that will need further work in the coming years. On the panel today, we will hear from Rolf Mazou, who is the UNHCR representative for Kenya. He's been with UNHCR for 24 years and has held various senior positions, but has field work in the Great Lakes region stretching back to the 90s and also in West Africa. We will then hear from Fatim Usman, who is currently working on combating climate change at the Ministry of the Environment and Fisheries in Chad. And has a focus on climate change in the Sahel and working on vulnerable groups. We will then hear from Francois Grunwald, who, if anyone's heard him speak in the Ignite stage last night, has an extraordinary capacity to deliver incredibly depressing news, but with a smile on his face. Francois is director of the group Urgence Réhabilitation Development and has worked in various posts with NGOs, with the UN and the ICRC, with over 35 years of experience around the world. And finally, we will hear from Andrei Zikus, who is coordinator of the Urban Basic Services branch with UN Habitat. The format of this session will be very similar to the format that you of the previous session, whereby we'll have brief presentations from all of our speakers, and then my hope is if the speakers are self-disciplined enough to keep to the 5 minutes limitations, there will be sufficient time whereby we'll be able to throw it open for questions and answers from you all to make it a more interactive perspective. So the first presentation is around a regional perspective on environmental programming and mainstreaming in refugee settings. Rolf, can I ask you to begin by speaking in a protracted displacement setting? Can you talk to some of the means by which you've been able to overcome the challenges of working on long-term issues such as the environment?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. We all know, and we've all seen refugee camps around the world. They are a symbol of a response, of a positive response, of solidarity to large displacement. But what we also know is that once these camps become protracted, they can become a serious threat to the environment. Threat to the environment in terms of reforestation or need for reforestation, threat to the environment in terms of water management, in terms of solid waste management. So it's clear that there are immediate solutions that are required, and some of these immediate solutions include indeed establishing green belts in the camp, includes having reforestation programs, serious reforestation program, better managing water, better managing solid waste. But that, I would say, are short-term solutions or short-term responses. What we've seen and what we're seeing more and more is that the long-term protracted response to a refugee situation through camps is absolutely not a solution. And what we need to do is to move from a humanitarian response to a more development or economic inclusion. The word integration sometimes is a problem, but going more towards economic inclusion. It's often difficult looking at the spaces and environments where refugees are often settled, but there are possibilities. One can use humanitarian resources in a different way. And there are new partnerships that we see more and more, additional resources that are coming from the development world to try and provide a response to a protracted refugee situation in a different way. The thing is that if we don't do that, these protracted camps can actually become not only a threat to the environment, but a threat to the security of the place where they are, fighting and conflict between host populations and refugees. And if the environment or the resources are completely depleted, I'm talking about fragile environment, what we can see is further displacement. So humanitarian response, immediate humanitarian response is good, is necessary, that we need to very quickly move towards long-term responses, economic inclusion, and that allows not just the host population, but also the refugees to have a more sustainable interaction with the environment in which they are. Thank you.
Thank you. An interesting reflection on the broader capacity opportunities for development of the host community around that, and that moving forward, that the imperative to use humanitarian responses in a different way is one that should be driving us all. Fatim, can I turn to you now? In the context of complex humanitarian situations, how can we do better, or how can we make sure that environmental interventions remain sensitive to vulnerable groups, particularly the needs of women and children and older people?
Thank you, sir, to give me a floor. So, I'm Fatima. I'm talking about how women. I will share how women preparing for the flow in Chad, how women dealing with the flow in Chad. But here Chad is considered one of poorest countries in Africa, In this context of effect of climate change, the population is vulnerable, especially the women. But vulnerable because many factors contribute to their vulnerability. They are affected by everything that touches their family. Women are the backbone for the subsistence, economic, and poverty leads them to seek water and wood until the recruiting by Boko Haram sect. Women in Chad, about the poverty, they don't have nothing to do, so they can, the tourism can pay them to recruit them some. Because the last year, there are just 1 or 2 women become they explode with the bombs because in the market in Chad. So otherwise, I think that there's very more vulnerability. Women is inability to exercise their human right because of the culture too. They are not informed about the risk, the disaster risk now. For example, include the several floods about 2006, 2007, and 2008, and the resulting consequences are on decision makers to urgently review the strategy, not only by providing assistance to the disaster victim, but also to put in place a structure in order to be able to adapt to any climate risk. So our government now is working as the different strategy to adapt to the effect of climate change. We are actually working with the women to create some income-generating activities as switching, making brooms in the dry grass, based in making soap with the local ingredients that make them up to processes of saponification. Some of them, they build dams and wells to keep the water, and then they use it for the cattle and their culture. And some of them, they make the reforestation is carrying out in close proximity to the drilling system so that they do not go very far to reach of the water or the wood. So that water does not flood the houses. The roof is made by the dry wood cane, and because that dry cane is impermeable, that they not let water coming in. So in conclusion, I think a strong woman that it's interesting in the environment and the motivation to participate spontaneously in the conservation program can be realized. So we should involve women through the participation in the shareholder meeting and the environment intervention during the disaster sites. They are the most affected person. Education could be the same as the case common of poverty. Eradication strategy need to be provided not only to women but to the community as the whole to ensure that roles are clearly shared. So the end, strong women capacity to reduce and manage natural disaster should not be a secondary concern, but an essential step toward building resilience community. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Fatima. Merci pour faire l'effort en anglais. Thank you, and a reminder of how climate change impacts will be felt disproportionately by particular parts of the population, and how programmatically we need to recognise that early and respond to that, and some really useful concrete examples of what that looks like. So thank you. Francois, can I turn to you next? And one of the things that struck me from your presentation yesterday was the experience you have in anticipating how this short-term mode of thinking of immediate sudden onset crises, how over time we can see how that's actually a false economy, if you like, and how obviously short-term crises very quickly become protracted ones and then sometimes permanent ones. So a sort of a very broad question on, once we realize that crisis will sort of draw into a protracted, drawn-out one, how can we do better to anticipate that move from the very beginning? How can we do better in programming from the beginning, recognizing that likely it will be there and sometimes in years to come or sometimes decades to come? Thank you.
I don't know for you, but for me, I arrived Sunday home, and one of my first tasks would be to plant trees to compensate my journey to come here. And I think if an institution can demonstrate engagement each time we travel to those conferences, we can demonstrate our capacity to compensate our carbon footprint of the trip. I think that would be a great gesture and a great demonstration of engagement for all our colleagues and for the coherence. I think one of the critical elements in our discussion is, in fact, it focuses a lot on refugees, displacement, and wood for firewood. In fact, this is a very important tree which masks part of the forest. I think one of the discussion, I think from Papua New Guinea, gave us a long discussion of what environment is, and in fact, environment is something very holistic. And maybe one of the first impact of protracted crisis / environment is in brains of the affected people. Kids who spend years in destroyed buildings, destroyed cities. Kids who spend years in refugee camps. Kids who spend years in a totally abnormal environment. They are the first victims. And they cannot bring a long-term vision because they are in the survival mode. So I think we have to look at this issue as something quite broad. We dismantle this issue in small pieces. You might remember this movie, how Yuan is removing the mountains. It was a movie on the Chinese Revolution, and the way Yuan removes the mountain is he breaks the mountain in small pieces, small stones, and moves the stones. So I will try to go to the stone level. One of the impact of protracted crisis is that people stay often in closed environments. Many protracted crises are characterized by small urban communities, small rural communities. We cannot get out. So they exploit the soil around them, and it becomes bare land. So those kind of security perimeters, which have been seen in Angola, in many places, as part of the way the war is waged, and when they last a long time, they have a detrimental impact on environment. There have been very interesting solutions that have been tried. Composting, trying to develop vertical agriculture, trying to make sure that there is no roof without a gutter to collect the water that could link to a small-scale family garden where family waste would be recycled. There are many possible options which have been developed to make sure that when people are in a closed environment, they cannot get far in the bush to cultivate, that you can still develop some capacity to maintain fertility of gardens and other things around, so that at least it's not totally degraded. We have seen some of the impact of those protracted crises on pastoral systems, because they block migration routes of the animals. And of course, this leads to very strong degradation, overgrazing, and in many countries, there are traditional systems to deal with pastoral problems. In few places, I've seen in Chad, for example, in the east of Chad, by engaging with the traditional mechanisms to deal with pastoral problems, many of those things were partly removed. So animals could go to other areas and you limit overgrazing. So if we are interested in that, then we have to try to understand how people have been traditionally managing those things and how can we build up on that. Another part of the impact of protracted crisis on the environment is they are often characterized by lawless environment. It's a place where everybody can go, cut forest, create illegal mines, pollute whatever they want. And I think one of the very important elements is how we can support whatever remains in terms of legal system, whatever exists in terms of discussion about protecting those resources against greedy companies would be very important. And if we cannot do it on the spot, we have to use structures like Human Rights Watch to monitor those things and to make sure that we keep the data. So one day, those companies can be held accountable. So this is something, and it has been done in some context. In some context, people are kind of, okay, this company, illegal company, they are taking so many hectares of forest, one day will come with a bill. So I think this is something which has been very important. Protracted displacement, I think our friend Ralph, which I know from many years, has explained the difficulties. Of course, when it comes to urban context, when displacements come to urban context, it adds to the fact that protracted crisis is often linked to protracted dysfunctioning of basic services. I'm sure our friend will talk about that, so I will not be long. But you can see cities where waste management is totally abnormal and for a long time, and this is quite dramatic quickly. Maybe two last points. Protracted crises are also linked to new ways to wage war. It can go for regular and protracted carpet bombing on human settlements. It can go with the use of personal mines and anti-tank mines to control and limit the circulation. And of course, this affects dramatically access to land, access to survival, to livelihood, etc. With one strange thing is that sometimes it protects forest. I've been a lot in Cambodia in the early 80s and just after the Khmer Rouge and until the peace agreement. And we could see forests on the satellite images, forests growing up to the peace agreement where demining process started and then forest reduced. So it's a paradox that in those situations, mind have been protecting forest environment much better than human beings. To come to close to a conclusion, this holisticity of the interaction between protracted crisis, psychological status of population, environment, I think has to be taken from a multidisciplinary angle. And this is often missing in our organization. We see some example. There have been some small example in the International Committee of the Red Cross, in some NGOs, to try to bring together not only environmentalists, but also anthropologists and economists to look at those things together. And I think this is probably one of the way forward, getting out of some of our disciplinary boundaries and try to work more in an interdisciplinary manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. And just to clarify, you aren't advocating the use of anti-personnel mines to protect forests.
Of course not.
But thank you for the presentation and also for the reminder of doing better about working in multidisciplinary ways and working in partnerships. And also a comment that resonated with me about working with the existing parts of the rule of law in those particularly lawless situations and with an emphasis on accountability. Andre, can I turn to you next? UN Habitat has a mandate for sustainable urbanisation. Can you talk about some of the programmatic lessons learned on implementing that mandate in protracted crises?
Thank you very much, Richard. As you've heard, UN Habitat, of course, is the short for United Nations Human Settlements Program, and this actually goes back, the creation of human settlements activities in the UN goes back to the Brundtland Commission 1972, which looked at environmental issues, and UN Habitat emerged from that with a mandate to actually work on the living environment of people. So wherever people settle, so large settlements, small settlements, that's the living environment which we're concerned with. And of course, what we're seeing is that the world is going through a very rapid transformation, and this large, rapid transformation is urbanization. The majority of the people, more than 50%, are living now in urban areas. And we're seeing unprecedented urban growth in Africa over the next 25 years. I think the urban population is nearly going to double in Africa. We see very rapid urban growth and urban population living in cities in Asia. And of course, what comes with that is that we're seeing more and more crisis, conflicts in cities, but we're also seeing cities in crisis. If we look at settlements, if we look at cities, they all have a hinterland, they require water, they have an ecologic footprint, they have waste streams going out of the cities, they require food, and protracted conflicts affect this sort of balance between cities and their hinterland. And this is, of course, something which is very much of a concern to us. I myself have been with the UN for 27 years and have been mainly working in the development sector. The Secretary General of the UN currently within his whole reform process is really trying to bring forward the nexus between humanitarian development and peace building. So at UN Habitat, we're also strongly and much more actively engaging in humanitarian and development nexus activities as a link to development. We had the Habitat 3 conference last year, which adopted the new urban agenda, which gives us very clear guidance of promoting resilient urban services in protracted conflict situations, full respect to international humanitarian law, and of course respect of the human rights of refugees and internally displaced people. There is an initiative which grew out of this, which is the Global Alliance for Urban Crisis, which is trying to bring together a multiplicity of stakeholders to really address urban crisis issues. I'd like to share with you some of the examples of UN Habitat's work over the years, and of course a focus of an agency looking at the living environment of people. We're sort of mandated dealing with local authorities, but also working with communities. And in the context of protracted conflicts, local authorities become weaker, have difficulties in providing services. So how can we support these? And of course, also, how can we support and work with communities if the local authority structures have collapsed? One project we've been doing is in Syria, in the urban areas of Syria, looking at solid waste management. And what we've seen is we had different factions in the city controlling different parts of the city. But with the waste piles heaping up, this was actually a way of getting the different factions fighting each other to talk to each other and actually let, on specific days and times, a waste truck go from one sector to the other to collect the waste and drop it. And this was actually a first initiative of actually having dialogue amongst these factions and sort of maybe a first step, very ambitious target, of course, peace building. So this is sort of one of the examples of the projects. Another project which we're working on is in northern Kenya, in Kalo Bay with UNHCR, which is a sort of new camp coming up. And one of the suggestions which we're making is, as we prepare for these camps, to have more durable solutions, to have plans, because these camps might be there for 10, 25 years, to actually have plans and designs for these camps which sort of resemble small settlements, small cities, where people will have amenities like a health post, they'll have an income generating opportunity there, they can maybe do some peri-urban agriculture in this area, and they have a design, a feel of actually being in a planned settlement. Because very often we find people living in temporary solutions for 10, 20 years and really suffer psychologically from this exposure. Another example we have is in eastern Congo, where we're looking at land and peace building. So actually looking at the legislative issues of people actually having a title to their land. And with this title to their land, they will also be able to protect from encroachment of scrupulous individuals, militia, but also protect the environment by being able to take care of the land and maybe work with it in a sustainable manner. And lastly, another project we're working on is in Somalia, peace building, working with the peacekeeping missions and developing environmental management systems for the peacekeeping missions, and then seeing what are the interventions which can be done to actually sustain and improve the environmental situation. Staying in the context of Somalia, we've also had challenges of, for instance, trying to set up a water utility in parts of Somalia, trying to set up something institutional which would provide a sustainable and clean, affordable water source for people in these areas. But it's very difficult without having a national legislative framework for this. But it's working, and having partnerships of other utilities in other parts of the world mentoring this little informal, if you want to call it like that, utility, or working with local authorities who are trying to struggle in providing services in actually generating a tax revenue so that people can actually pay taxes where it's possible through small businesses, and the local authority can then start providing services again, because that's the first step of normality for a longer term solution. So these are just some of the examples I just wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, and thank you. Thank you for giving the concrete examples. And can I ask, I'll take the privilege of as moderator to ask the first question, maybe for yourself and for Rolf as well, to talk more about the project on that you're doing together in northern Kenya on sustainable urban planning in refugee settlements. Can you talk a little bit more about, obviously, the details of the project, but what sort of challenges have you encountered in trying to programmize in a different way, and how you've overcome those challenges? Maybe a question for that both of you could speak to, and then we could throw it open for questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you very much. And as Andre has said, indeed, I think it was two years ago that we were provided with additional land by the county government of Turkana. But the county government of Turkana said we would want to see something different than the usual refugee camp. Turkana is a place which considers that more urbanization will actually help their development. And they said having a structured and well laid out settlement, they didn't want to use the word camp, would be something that would actually help them in the long term. But of course, as UNHCR, we do not have that kind of experience. We're used to setting up camps, which, as I said earlier, are meant to be short term, but last for a very long period of time. So we partnered with UN Habitat, which was a bit of a first in the environment where we were here in Kenya. And what we wanted to see is a number of things. First, engaging the government much better than we normally do, and UN Habitat has that kind of experience. And then have an approach that is actually long-term, saying this is a settlement that could still be there in 20 years. Can we set it and start it in that manner? Does it mean that refugees will stay there forever? Not necessarily. They may. That will depend on the kind of relationship they will develop with the host population. But at least they will be there for the next 5 years. So it was worth for us the investment with an organization that has the expertise and experience in human settlement. Of course, there are many challenges. We are a different organization. We think differently. We want things very fast. UN Habitat sees things more in the long run, in long term. But I think working together, we will be able to establish a settlement that will help the host population and the refugees. And as Andre said, the idea in doing that is to have the maximum level of self-reliance for refugees living in that environment. So the idea is not to have a camp that is meant for people who will continue to receive humanitarian assistance until they return, but is to put in place a settlement that will actually help and lead towards more self-reliance.
Maybe just to add on, the colleagues who've been working on this are in our urban planning and development branch. And a lot of the colleagues come from a development background, so they were not really familiar with the speed at which the population would actually move into this area. So they were still planning, and all of a sudden the people were streaming in, they were already there. So that was sort of a change of mind which our colleagues needed, was that there has to be a speedier response to planning, sort of a rapid planning approach, and but still getting the basics for a settlement right. The second thing, I think, which was experienced in the context of Kalo Bay is also the access to water. This was, of course, the land was given, it was designed and laid out, but then at one stage, I think the aquifer studies actually showed that the yield would not be sufficient to actually support a larger population, and also the concept of actually having peri-urban agriculture around this area. So this is also something to be kept in consideration when these locations are chosen, and also when the designs are done, so that one sort of has an harmony between sort of the resources to support this environment. And of course, the next step would be, if it should grow further, that water would have to come from further afield, which would make it, let's say, more challenging in this area. And I think the third element, of course, is also very important, is really the host communities, the surrounding communities. So if we design something which is of a better standard than what the surrounding communities are seeing, it can easily cause to friction. So we have to really link this as the planning is done, to work with the government, and at the same time also improve the planning, improve the settlements in the host and surrounding communities to avoid any sort of animosities. Thanks.
Yeah, we have been evaluating a lot of those programs in different contexts from many years ago, including Nyala in Darfur and other places. And we did a very interesting study on Dadaab 7 or 8 years ago. For us, it was very interesting because we saw the old part of Dadaab, which I've seen in '92 the first time, the classical vertical, you know, the refugee camp was planned as a military camp. And then 10 years after, 12 years after, things became round. Then there was a place where the mosque was put, and then houses were around, and then there was a place of the market. So after 10 years, the camp became a city, organized as a city, spontaneously, with very little. And then just nearby, there was a new influx of Somali refugees, and it was again the Roman refugee camp set up. So no lessons were learned at that time. And I think one of the critical elements, and we discussed that with UNHCR, and we had the same debate that we had in Nyala in Darfur a couple of years before. There are two problems. One is, of course, until they are convinced that they can use that new settlement as a new city, the local authorities, they say, we don't want that. So UNHCR and NGO working with them get stuck to the permanent settlement and no urban approach. The second element, of course, the donors, they don't want to invest because it's quite cheap to do the plastic stuff in logistic, easy, accessible raw. It's much more complex, it's a bit more costly to think, okay, if this camp is there for 5-10 years, how do we create an acceptable living environment for the people that would be there, and just not this row of white tents that we have seen at the camp. We have to continue advocating. I think we have to get political backup to UNHCR, to UN Habitat, to go more on these camps are there. They are also an opportunity for the local cities nearby to get a chance to get a support for proper urban planning. So we have to get that strong support. Otherwise, UNHCR will be compelled to do the kind of the Baba Roman camp, as you have all seen in Asterix. And that would create an environment which is absolutely terrible for people.
Thank you. We'll take a few rounds of questions from the audience, if we have any questions for our panelists. Please.
Thank you. Excellent presentations. And first of all, my name is Peter Gilruth. I'm working currently with the World Agroforestry Center. And I was interested in Andre Ziku's comments in terms of trying to plan for the future and that type of thing. And one of my colleagues at the World Agroforestry Center described the situation across the Ugandan, South Sudanese border, where the Ugandan government is making an attempt to integrate as much as possible. I don't know what their capacity is now. I've never been there. The refugees that are coming across the border into Uganda. And one of the things that they're doing is in that integration, introducing tree planting schemes so that not only do they not degrade the environment in those communities in northern Uganda, but hopefully, if and when they do return to South Sudan, they're coming with skills that they can bring back to their own country. I don't know how many successful examples the panel has seen of, maybe like the Ugandan government, of being able to accommodate such refugees, but and integrating them as opposed to just, the center, and then eventually going from military to something else in the future. Good examples. But if you have any experience in that, so that there's not just the one model, but there are other models that could be explored. That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We'll take a couple more questions and then throw it over to the panelists. Vim.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question or a comment on best practices, and especially I wanted to single out the work done by UN Habitat, which was really interesting this year on the response to the Mosul operation, where UN Habitat made a sort of overview of environmentally hazardous sites in Mosul. So with that overview, humanitarian responders would be aware of where there might be a potential pollution risk for communities or for responders. So I was wondering, first of all, congratulations with that very interesting development on making these kind of maps available and doing this kind of assessment. And secondly, to what extent can it be incorporated so this can become more standard in these kind of conflict or post-conflict settings to make maps on environmental hazards in urban areas, and what kind of information or what kind of process would be helpful in supporting this kind of work to be done?
So why don't we hand it over to the panelists now? There were two questions there. One was sort of essentially other experiences of integration, other ways in which this can be done differently. And then a second question on mapping in Mosul, particularly conflict-related pollution, but other forms of mapping and how those are integrated into the responses. Andrew.
Thank you very much. Well, integration into societies and incorporation, there are a few examples. There are not that many which we are aware of. I mean, we've done a few projects now in northeastern Iraq where we've designed so-called refugee camps as planned city extensions. So we had a negotiation with the mayor first, and the mayor actually agreed to build a suburb as a planned city extension. It was also designed as a settlement, so it didn't look very much different. The way we convinced the mayor was, well, if one day the refugees should leave, you actually have an asset in the city. You will have a functioning water supply system. You'll have a housing stock which you can use, and they bought into that. But it was on a one-by-one basis, and there are some examples in this area, but I think we need many, many more, and we have to really focus on this as a future activity. Concerning the hazard mapping, we have a tool which is called city profiling, which is sort of a rapid assessment tool for cities, and which then provides visual maps of where hazards are, what's the contamination of water sources. We've done this in parts of Iraq, we've done this in Syria, and this is now available online. So if you visit the UN Habitat website, you can actually see these maps. I think we have 5 settlements now in Iraq and about 2 or 3 in Syria for these city profiles. So these are fairly rapid assessment tools to get a quick assessment, which is fairly cheap, using remote sensing data, using sort of artificial intelligence systems also to get into this. So using the latest kind of technologies, using drones to get this information in a fairly quick and a fairly cheap way. And we're just in the process of expanding this city profiling tool to Libya together with the European Union. So you can actually visit our website and see this, and also then go into the maps for each of the cities. Thank you.
To continue a bit, because this is a subject we have been working very closely with UNHCR, you have to remember that 10 years ago, when you ask someone about the link between humanitarian aid and urban crisis, people were just laughing. When we launched our project, War in Cities at War, 15 years ago, no support at all. Nobody was interested. It required 80 earthquakes where UN Habitat and ourselves have been kind of putting loud and clear, if you walk in a city, you need urban lenses, otherwise it will not work. So now this has been, there has been big progress. I think the Urban City Alliance, we're also a member of it, is a good example of that, but we still have to continue and support that. Uganda is a very interesting case because, again, as an evaluation institute, we did the evaluation of the response to the Lord Army couple of years ago. And Uganda has gone through terrible difficulties in managing those protracted displacement. They were mainly internal displacement, but it was at the end similar problems. So they have learned the hard way. And they knew, and we knew from the very beginning of the crisis of this intake of this flow of refugees to Uganda, we immediately, at the highest level, they say, we don't want to have the same mess as we had, and then they developed rapidly a strategy to prevent the creation of big camps, of big concentration, and I think this is quite something new. And this is something that should be studied in length, and dispatch, the learning element of that should be also made available. There are some forums for that. For example, there is, you all know probably of the Kampala Convention on Refugees and Displacement in Africa. This is convening regularly. There are groups of the African states. We meet regularly to see how is this Kampala Convention applied, how to improve it, etc. These are fora where a lot of those experiences, the listen learn done by UNEP, the one done by Ugandan government, should be brought together to help the collective wisdom of African government to go the right step further and that would be mainly through African example. So I think we have to push that dynamic.
No, thank you. Francois has covered most of it. You have other examples. You have Tanzania, for instance, Burundi refugees in the 70s who arrived, were gradually integrated to the extent that they became nationals of the country. But it's clear that we need, and as Francois said, we need resources. We need different partners around the table. Development, humanitarian, as I said earlier, but it's clear that it's the only way forward. There is, and the type of camps that Francois was referring to earlier, there is no resources anymore to pay for that. There is no resources anymore to sustain a camp for 25, 26 years. Dadaab has been there for 26 years, and regularly we encounter difficulties in mobilizing resources to maintain. It's very difficult to go today to the international community and say that for another 10 years we're going to provide humanitarian food assistance every 2 weeks or every month. And everybody can imagine what it makes to the psychology of somebody who stays in this kind of environment, and what it does to the relationship between people in this kind of environment, and also how it disempowers someone to go back to his or her country and be part of reconstruction. So there is a clear understanding now that having these camps for this kind of length actually creates more conflict. But we need to bring people around the table, different people around the table, and as I said, it's a lot of resources. Doing a camp, distributing food assistance every month and having a few boreholes is something that costs something, but having infrastructure that are long-term and are actually looking at development costs more, and it's a different type of source of funding than what we normally have. But it is, and I think André was referring to that earlier, it is not easy to get development actors to come and invest in a situation which length is not known. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more round of questions and comments from the audience, please.
Yes, thank you very much for your guiding us this session. My question goes to UN Habitat. I know UN Habitat, they do some projects and interventions in Somalia. So my key concern is that the sustainability of those projects. How do you ensure those projects they are sustainable and has an impact to the community in terms of the follow-up and what I also know, the awareness of the community to show that these projects are the owners of the project. Those are my concerns. My question is just to know it. Thank you.
Nicola?
Thank you. Also on Somalia and also to Habitat, a small bureaucratic question from a non-governmental organization. You mentioned that, among other things, you're introducing environmental management systems for peacekeeping operations, if I understood correctly. As far as I know, this is not a traditional field of occupation for UN Habitat. So was this coincidental? How did this come about?
Please up the back, and then Ollie.
Thank you. My name is Philip. I'm from ICRC, and this question can be for anyone in the panel, including the chair. I'm sure Francois knows a study that was done, Roots of Behavior. Now, the Roots of Behavior by ICRC, when it comes to IHL, humanitarian law, and how effective it is or not effective to different actors, from state actors to non-state actors. Now, I'm looking at the environment and the connection to humanitarian law, okay? Laws that relate to protection of the environment and vice versa. How, in your experiences, how do you integrate, some sort of roots of restraint when it comes to the environment in context of conflict? And maybe Francois can help me. I'm not a lawyer, but I would want to understand from an IHL or public international perspective, law perspective, how do you do that? We are looking at the roots of restraint beyond conflict. How do you, as the lady said from, I think, Guatemala, put the environment almost in the same context as human life? Thank you.
Thank you. A very simple question. Ollie, please. Oh, sorry, one from Ollie and then one from here.
Thank you very much. Fascinating presentations. I guess I was just picking up on some of these issues, really interesting developments that Andre was talking about in terms of urban extension, refugee camps, building new suburbs around an existing city, and some of the issues that Raul was talking about in terms of planning and long term. And my understanding has always been, and maybe I'm massively out of touch on this, but one of the challenges with refugee camps was the political imperative to not encourage people to stay for a long time, and so there's a prohibition in Dadaab, for example, I understand, on building permanent structures. So my question is, do you see that changing from a government perspective even? Is that something where governments are becoming more willing to think about humanitarian action that has that long-term development outcome in terms of local infrastructure? We've seen it already in Uganda, I guess, which is a particular case. But is that something that you see elsewhere around the world? Thank you.
Please.
It's just a comment. In Guatemala and Central America, we don't have refugee camps, but we have displacement people. Other causes, probably, but the problems that you are presenting here are the same. So I was wondering if there is like some research or someone working on that problem in Central America, so please contact me, or it's just general comment, so thank you.
Thank you. So we had a couple of questions specifically for UN Habitat. We had a very broad question going to some really complicated issues on restraint, the role of law and behavioural change. We had a question about political will and whether or not that's shifting towards a more long-term vision. Perhaps we could start with UN Habitat, but also move down the panel so that everyone has the chance to give their final remarks.
Very briefly, thank you very much for the question on Somalia and how we work with the communities. We have a community empowerment program or community development program at UN Habitat, which works very closely in over time setting up community structures, community groups, empowering communities to actually assess their own environmental situation, doing self-surveys, prioritizing what kind of interventions they would like to do first, and then, of course, also seeing what are the ways of providing the services. Could it be external? Could it be internal? And then, of course, also maintaining the system. So it's sort of a closed-loop system. We call it the people's process. And we've tried this in Sri Lanka, in Asia. We've tried this in Africa, in Somalia. We also have ways of working. Very often, UN agencies provide contracts to implement projects, but we actually have mechanisms as a UN agency, which is quite unique, of doing community contracting. So we don't have to go through engineering firms, through contracting firms, but we can actually do a community contract system where we can pay directly to a local community or CBO to implement projects once they've set up a structure and once they have some form of accounting system or administrative system within this. So this is part of the sustainability approach. Of course, we have to be aware these processes take long. We've been working in Afghanistan for more than 20 years, and some of these people's process community setups are still working independent of under which political system they were working at that time. Yes, for UN Habitat, working in peacekeeping is a new area. This is coming very much from the Secretary General giving us an impetus of saying we have to link much more development, humanitarian, and peace building. So this is sort of an experiment for us also to see how working with the peacekeeping missions, working on tools which we've developed at UN Habitat on environmental management systems in urban areas can be applied in that context. We have our two colleagues, Lisette and Davis. They can put up their hand, who can also brief you a little bit more after this session. They're actually implementing the project on what is going on there. And for Ollie, yes, we have seen, I mean, very often national legislation does not allow for people to stay, but what we've noticed is when we go to the subnational level and we do sort of individual negotiations with mayors, they have a level of discretion. In Iraq, some of the mayors refused. They said, no, this is not for us, but in 2-3 other cases they agreed. So it's a step-by-step process, and the more we can show this works and we can get other mayors to visit those settlements, it's sort of, you know, it'll grow. So we're at the beginning of this, but there is an opportunity, but we're still at baby steps in this area. I think I'll leave the rest for our colleagues.
Francois, did you want to go next?
Maybe to jump and to bring a bit of salt and pepper on your comment, to define what is an urban community is something very complicated. They are very mobile. The creation is not like a village, and it's made of all kind of looks. So in places where there are clearly identified mobility, this is some community. This is sometimes part of the conflict itself. In places where they are more socially, ethnically mixed, then they can be. So I think defining in those type of situations what is an urban community is extremely difficult. We did some interesting studies in Mogadishu a couple of years ago at a time where there was no body present there. The UN were just not present in Mogadishu. They were just MSF and a few NGO. And it was very interesting because by looking at the history of the construction, physical and demographic construction of the city, we could see both lines of conflict and line of peace possibilities, just by looking at the history of the settlement. So we need to do that type of things in an important manner. To come back to the issue, the global issue, indeed, in the international humanitarian law, there are provisions that look at environment issues, both in the third convention, in the fourth convention, and in the two additional protocols. It is said that attack and destruction of the environment where people live, where they can develop their livelihood, where they can have access to services, is against international humanitarian law, and that armies that do that, countries that do that, are kind of committing war crimes if they do that. So it is there. It's not very used. It has not been used much, but it is there. Their options are there to explore. Of course, it's much more complicated when you are in conflicts which go below the international law descriptions, where you are more on inter-community conflict, where you are more in what is called often other source of violence, which are not fully in the IHL, but there are still always options, and I think we have to push all the time for these options to be taken. Beyond conflict, I was very interested in the comment you made that you have been working with the people from the different sides of the conflict so that they can work together for waste management. Because this is critical in the future. For those who have been involved in humanitarian aid during the Bosnian crisis, you might remember that there were special commissions between all the parties for exchange of dead bodies. I was very involved in that at that time with the International Committee of the Red Cross. The key militaries that were involved in negotiating exchange of dead body between the different parties were key actors in the peace process later on. So those kind of, through management of local resources, those kind of exchange that can take place can have a very important weight on possibilities of peace to kind of grow and develop. So I think these are options. And in fact, in many contexts, and I would just stop because I speak too much, I've been helping the development, the support to the veterinary sector in North Mali during the First War. Now when I go in Timbuktu and Gao, all my friends, whether they are with the jihadists, they just know me. And it's big protection. And I can go in places where nobody can go because they know that I've been involved in supporting livestock and supporting the management of local resources, which are important cross-clan, cross-ethnic, cross-group. So I think if we can develop that culture of supporting what is bringing people together traditionally, then it has big impact, and environment and natural resources are key to that. The impact on peace processes are very important.
So I will add just a little bit experience about refugees coming from the conflict of Republic Central Africa and Chad. But the government in Chad is not ready to be accommodate them. So the things that they do, they come and they stay in the school. They don't have the refugee camp. So some of them goes to the families they don't know before, because a lot of people from Central Africa was lived before in Chad, and then they immigrate to Central Africa, and they lose everything about the culture in Chad, everything. And then when the conflicts come from Central Africa, they know way to go, and they come back in Chad. But in Chad, they had no family, nothing, so they stay in the school. Some of them, they stay in the hospital, they live in the hospital, and they create another conflict with the resource, because the government has to support them with the food, but with the living style, they don't have nothing to do. So people in Chad, they are already poor, so they try to sharing with them, and then to keep some of them in their house. And this causing a big problem, because if you don't know no one and you bring it to your home, it's gonna create a big deal. So some of the people who say that, who lodging, some of the people lodging some refugees in this house, and then create some of like a little bit like fighting is home, and like some of them is like very dangerous, and the abuse to the kids, like the abuse to the kids in the home too, and then we don't have nothing to do, so they put them in the jail, and I think it's not the best place for them, but don't have choice, so it's too hard to work with them. So with the refugee and the system in humanitarian, is very hard to work with the refugees in this case.
Thank you. Maybe last point, there was a question on our government changing in the way they see the shift from humanitarian assistance to more development responses. Here in Nairobi on the 25th of March, the IGAD heads of state met for the first time to look at the Somali refugee situation. And one of their conclusions was that they needed to move more towards economic integration of refugees. not integration in the sense of them staying forever, but a greater economic integration. Countries like Ethiopia, country like Uganda, it was mentioned before, are now looking at things in a different way. The reason why they do that is because of evidence and because of the fact that there are more and more economic studies that prove that it is in the interest of countries which receive a large number of refugees to make sure that they are economically integrated as fast as possible. They return faster to their place of origin. They're in a better position of being part of the reconstruction of their country, and the relationship and the negative impact that they have on the community in the place where they are is much lower. The negative impact is much lower. So evidence are now pushing countries to see the management of forced displacement in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you. We're out of time. I would like to thank all of the panelists for what has been, in my opinion. Please, we have a brief period of time. Thank you. Thank you for your last comment. Thank you. We are out of time, so please join me in thanking our panelists for what has been a very rich conversation with a little bit of everything. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think we should also give a hand to Richard for his eminent moderation of this session. Thank you, Richard. So, without further ado, we will continue, and bear with us. You will very soon be active yourself in this session. So, first, two announcements that I want to make. The first one is that there will be a side event at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and it's an appel seminar. And that this seminar or presentation will actually guide you through the appel process. And it takes place at 3 p.m. in conference room number 9. Secondly, we're about to send out to all of you participants a link to a survey, and that survey can be done online. And the survey is about the disaster waste management guidelines that we're supposed to revise in a short time span from now. So please fill that out if you find that you have something to contribute. And if you know of someone that you want to send this link further to, please do that. That is very welcome. So it is a pleasure for me now to introduce that we will have two participants in this session that we will have right now. The first one that I would like to introduce is Monika Mcdivitt. And Monika is the Deputy Director of the Division of Environmental Policy Implementation here at UN Environment in Nairobi, an officer in charge of UN Environment's International Ecosystem Management Partnership. Secondly, the moderator for this session will be Mr. Carl Bruch, who's sitting here beside me. And Carl directs international programs at the Environmental Law Institute in the US. His work focuses on environmental governance, disasters, conflicts, and peace building. He has helped countries and organizations throughout the world to develop and strengthen their environmental laws, improve institutions, and build capacity. Welcome, the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. We are running a little behind, so I will try to keep my remarks briefer. I'd like to start the discussion of looking forward by looking back. And we can all use Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine, go back to 1991, the end of the 1991 Gulf War, more than 600 oil wells set on fire, the world's largest oil spill in the Persian Gulf, and Premier Gorbachev calling on the UN to establish a mechanism for responding to environmental disasters. The UN had no such mechanism or means. After debate and discussion, the UN Department for Humanitarian Affairs, the predecessor to OCHA, and UNEP had an exchange of letters, and they created the Joint Environment Unit. And that was 1994. The next year was the first advisory group on environmental emergencies meeting. We had 9 of those meetings, 3 environmental emergencies forums. And it's interesting to reflect on how far we've come. And I think that in the opening session, the executive director, Eric Solheim, said it really well, that we are better prepared for catastrophes than we were. But there are still huge challenges, and there's much that we must do to prepare for worse catastrophes. I'd like to pair that with the observation that Jesper made in the opening also, that we must do this, we must take these steps together. If one single actor or event could have resolved the challenge of addressing environment and humanitarian action, he said, it would have already been done. The way we are doing this is that we are bringing together the humanitarian expertise, the development expertise, the environmental expertise, the security expertise. And this is this integration is one of the big changes that I have seen in my professional career. That we have, we're starting to really address this in a more intersectoral, interdisciplinary manner. And we're looking not only at the problem right in front of us, but looking at how did we get here, where do we go from here? So we're also looking in a more strategic way at this. And so looking forward, looking at the next steps, I'd like to highlight a few things that see coming out of this. First and foremost, the dialogue that has been going on for the last 22 years is really rich. It's continuing. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that with the shift from the Advisory Group on Environmental Emergencies to the Environmental Emergencies Forum, we see more actors. There are some people who are here and have been here many times, but there are a lot of new actors too. And this expands the networks, expands the exchange of knowledge. It is clear now more than ever that environment and humanitarian goals and actions go hand in hand. And platforms such as the Environmental Emergencies Forum and the Environmental Emergencies Center and all these other forums that we've discussed in the last 2.5 days provide means for bringing people together and provide opportunities for further integrating our expertise and response capacities. Change is happening. We have new methods, new actors. Yesterday, we were talking about how social media and the expansion of cell phones into the most remote areas of many of the countries we work in has revolutionized how we work and how societies respond to disasters. And frankly, there are many opportunities that we have not tapped into. And so we see the change coming. And I think that there's a lot of promise there. I'd like to highlight a few recommendations that seem to be coming out of the forum. First, environmental safeguards and markers must be formalized and incorporated at the design phase of a project, at the earliest phase, not just when we step into the situation before us. There's a need to mainstream environmental elements into all emergency response trainings and to strengthen the Environmental Emergencies Center as a knowledge hub. It already has a lot of trainings. These can be updated, they can be expanded, and we can draw upon your experience, your tools, your training modules. There's a lot of discussion on disaster waste management as a resource for reconstruction and recovery, for livelihoods, for building back better, and a call for regional platforms on disaster waste management to be established. One of the things that's so interesting about this forum is how many different things happened here. And if you kind of sit back and look at it, and look at, not just from what you achieved, but what others achieved, we saw some amazing, inspiring actors who won the Green Star Awards. But we also see, for example, this framework for environment in humanitarian action. This has a bit of history, and I just want to highlight that because this was called for at the last Environmental Emergencies Forum. And there were discussions around this. And then in 2016, we saw the launch of discussion of this in the context of the Leading Edge program. And this is an effort by by OCHA and governments to provide an ongoing dialogue around humanitarian action, and a task force on environment in response that called for an update to the rapid environmental assessment. Fast forward a year, we're here, there's a draft, and we're consulting you. We're drawing upon the most recent experiences, all the different bodies of knowledge that you hold. And this will be leading to a revised framework. And I want to highlight this because it's sometimes hard to see how all these discussions lead to change. But if we just had people sitting in an office coming up with it, it would probably be better, but it wouldn't be nearly as good as it would be if we had this discussion that we had yesterday. We've also launched the Flash Environmental Assessment Tool in French, English, Spanish, and Russian. We've propelled the development of disaster waste management guidelines that will be revised and relaunched next year. My new friend Khalif launched the Somali Institute of Environmental Peace, an inspiring organization working in an incredibly difficult situation. There was a call to develop practical guidance on what's available and what's possible in terms of both remote and field-based data collection and use on environmental risks related to conflict. And again, this is where there are so many new opportunities that countries and organizations are dealing with. How do we do this? How do we use it? How do we caveat it appropriately? At least 16 different people and organizations committed to sharing information on the environment in emergency response exercises, the inputs, the injects into these, which is going to improve future capacity building efforts. That happened here. Multiple environmental experts signed up on the Humanitarian ID Environmental Experts Community. And those who haven't, and I'll be honest, I found out about this morning. I don't know how I missed it, but I found out about this morning. I signed up. You can too. Humanitarian.id. That's the URL. Just type into your browser humanitarian.id and sign up. And with that, I want to emphasize that we all have a role to play. The joint unit, throughout its lifetime, at its best had 7 people. It typically has 4 or 5. It is incredibly lean, and it provides so much help. And we need to move from asking what the joint unit can do for you to asking what you can do for the joint unit, and to build coalitions, build partnerships, and build political commitment. And with that, it's time for your commitments. And you should have, if you, some cards, paper, bits of paper. If you don't, there's a pile here, and we can get that to people. And so for the next 20, 25 minutes, we'd like to have you go around and talk to people. Talk to people, ideally, that you did not know before this forum, new people. And see where you have common interests, where you can share something, where you might be able to do something. And write down on those colored cards a joint commitment. Sign it, take photos. They will be collected at the end. But we want to use this as an opportunity to talk to people, especially that are new. And what can you do, or what can they do, what can you do together? So what sort of commitments are we talking about? Commitments to maybe develop joint guidance, or undertake advocacy efforts together, or undertake trainings. It could be to develop or implement a project. And be smart about it. These commitments should be specific and significant. They should be measurable and meaningful. They should be achievable and action-oriented. Be realistic and try to make sure it's tangible and time-bound. And with that, please start talking, start networking, start figuring out what you can do moving forward.
There's a grumpy old man.
Yes.
Oh,
yes, yes.
I was not introduced this yet, so
yes.
He actually defies to sit here,
yes.
So maybe you can
yes,
convince him that he can sit here.
Yes.
But then you have to announce him, you know?
Everyone, we have about 2 minutes left, so if you're coming to a conclusion on your commitments, you've got 2 minutes. Okay, everyone, I'd like to ask people to return to their seats. Everyone, please, can you return to your seats, please? Thank you. It's impressive that after 2.5 long days, the people are still full of energy. It's really exciting to have people linking. I'd like to just briefly talk about the commitments. The organizers will collect these and then record them and then send you scans of them so that you will have the commitments for yourself. But please make sure that your name is on it, and I guess legible so that they can figure out to whom it should be sent. I'd like to quickly ask, how many people got at least one commitment? Just raise your hands. 5? 6? Okay. 6, excellent. 7? 6 commitments in less than half an hour. That's impressive. With that, I'd like to introduce the grumpy gentleman to my left, Jesper Lund, who you have known from the beginning of our session here, and again, Monika Mcdivitt. And I'd like to invite you to share some of your perspectives on the discussions both in the from the commitments, but also more broadly from the forum. How do your institutions take forward all the different ideas and calls for action that have been discussed here at the forum? Jesper, maybe start with you.
Yeah, the typical way the United Nations is doing it is that we write them down and we make resolutions or conventions, and then we make bureaucratic frameworks around them, and then it becomes like more policing approach, and we use them as bureaucratic tools. But I don't see that as being the way forward here. I think this is about changing habits and changing mindsets, and go out and walk the talk. By us being examples ourselves and for our organizations, and demonstrate our commitments to the commitments. I like Francois' example of planting trees. It doesn't help that we make commitments from 9 to 5 and then we don't behave accordingly. So if this should have an impact, we need to ensure that it's sort of spreading out. I like the idea of what do you call them, environmental markers as a very concrete example that has to be in project proposals. And there's a little bit of the policing as well. And if we can get donors and institution funding in humanitarian proposals, only doing so if they include environmental markers as they have to include gender markers, I think that will be a concrete way forward. That's a little bit the bureaucratic. There will be other examples, I'll give them later on, but I would like Monika to take over the floor.
Thanks, Jesper. I just want to perhaps reflect on a couple of things, picking up from what Jesper has said. And one of the things that I've learned in this past couple of days is that what seems to some of us as being very self-evident is not so obvious to others. And I think that's a reflection on how we immerse ourselves in our particular passion or our particular discipline. And, you know, when I heard that, you know, didn't really take environment into consideration in a humanitarian disaster, and I'm thinking, how could you not? But, you know, for me, it is just so all-consuming in everything I've done for everything in my career the last 35 years that it is so self-evident that I cannot conceive that somebody else wouldn't see it as obvious either, but that's not the case. And so one of the most important lessons I learned many years ago on a leadership thing was that we always must listen or take heed of the minority voice, those people who say something a little bit different from the group think. And I think these types of fora, these opportunities for engagement, these abilities to interact and come not in the boxes, but in the spaces between the boxes is really critically important. And to learn from each other because it's not always self-evident to everyone else in the room. So I think that was a good reflection. And from a more institutional perspective, it just highlights yet again the vast richness in many of these institutions, but the need to have those platforms and those abilities to come together and to share those and to take those kind of lessons forward, even if it just resonates within you, because that is something that you may then be able to take into your own realm and make that little bit of a difference. So I think those are the sort of things that are incredibly valuable in these kinds of fora that I've certainly learned over the last 2.5 days. And I think from an institutional and a personal perspective, we can all say that we've come out of here perhaps better people than when we came in. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Monika, I'm curious, just over 2 months, we'll have the UN Environment Assembly, UNEP 3. Here in the very halls that we've been spending the last few days in. Wondering, how do you see the discussions and outcomes from the Environmental Emergencies Forum feeding in to UNEP?
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question. It's a very big question, and it's one that we could have an entire 2.5-day forum on its own. But I think sort of in a nutshell, it all comes down to that appreciation that everything is connected. So the kind of resolutions that we have in front of us from an environmental perspective take cognizance of the ethos of the 2030 development goal and the SDGs, in that they were intentionally designed to be integrated. And so when we look at individual resolutions, they all have links somewhere to each other. And the kind of outcomes that are emanating from this particular discussion have multiple entry points into informing ministers during the ministerial forum section that will happen at the Environment Assembly, where the ministers will be talking very specifically around pollution. And that's fantastic, but we also have a resolution around environmental issues of armed conflict. And so there's a perfect segue into bringing those aspects of contamination and pollution due to disasters, emergencies, conflicts, and things like that into a ministerial level discussion with ministers responsible for the environment from around the world. So that's just one example of where the kind of outcomes from this forum could, be fed into background papers and that sort of thing. We also, of course, will have in front of us resolutions on things like education and chemicals and reporting on how we've done over the last 2 years or 1.5 years since the last UNEA, and we can honestly say that we've contributed to furthering the resolutions that we already have on the table. So it does give us that evidence that we've been able to make progress toward our commitments already. So I don't think we have anywhere near the time to go through resolution by resolution, but certainly the ability and I think the power that we have to influence at the ministerial level through bringing in these kind of real examples that hit home and make it real is a very important way that the outcomes of this forum can inform ministers, can inform their influencers, their delegations, and create that dialogue.
Thank you. Jesper, it sounded like you had a few other thoughts on the way forward.
Yes, when I arrived here in Nairobi the other evening and was driving into our guest house, my reflection was that you're now coming to Nairobi. I haven't been to Nairobi for 5 years, but what do I see on the road coming into to Nairobi proper is a commercial for McDonald's, Starbucks, Burger King, etc. And we tend to become more and more globalized. And it's fine that we have these overall strategies, that we have political commitments in big forums like the environmental forum that is coming up, but we have to bear in mind the localization. We can only be successful and sustainable in implementation of all the activities that we discussed and came up with as a way forward if we are connected with the local communities and bring them on board, because we tend to come in, fix, and then drop and run, and then expect them to be able to carry it forward. And they simply can't unless it's built on their way of thinking, their way of living, and their way of livelihood. So I think while we have these sort of grand scheme ideas, we need to then make them adjustable to the local settings every time.
I think Jesper's reminded us of a very important point, in that most of us, or many of us, tend to work at an international or even a global level. But unless we make that connection with the local level, then it gets hard to stay real, as it were. And one of the things that we can also go back to in terms of the Environment Assembly to say how can we show that we've done a good job and are moving things forward is through partnerships, because no single one of us can really truly be effective or as effective as we want to be alone. And so working in partnerships is a way to demonstrate to our member states, to the governments, to all of you who are taxpayers as well, that your tax money is being well spent on the UN, so that we are working together as an integrated body, bringing in stakeholders and partnerships, and to show them that these vibrant partnerships are meaningful and are advancing the agendas much faster and much more concretely than if we were all doing things alone. So I think we have to look at partnerships and the success criteria around partnerships. And again, the kind of outcomes from this forum really point in that direction, and we can prove it to our member states. And that's, I think, a very powerful indicator that we are doing what they are expecting us to do. So these are really important things to keep in mind that may not have been a particular agenda topic, but is a natural sort of outcome of the way we work together.
Excellent. And so I think I'm going to try to respect the schedule and wind up there. But I do want to close with just drawing your attention to one of the things in your booklets, your handouts that you got. These are the major activities of the joint unit from 2015 to 2017. And if you look through it and you realize, it goes right to the partnership point. The joint unit is incredibly lean, and they have done an incredible amount of work over the last 2 years, but they've done it in partnership with governments, with NGOs, international organizations, local organizations. The way we make this happen is we work together. And when we do, we really accomplish some pretty good things. I think we need to keep that in mind because we work in some really grim places, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. We need to celebrate our successes. And with that, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your enthusiasm.
I'm going to boldly and unashamedly ask you to do one more thing, now that we've sort of said thank you. And that is, you've made commitments on all these little yellow pieces of paper, but I'd like to ask you to make another commitment. If you go to the website www.beatpollution.org, please sign up to some more commitments, because everything you do can make a difference. There's some boxes where you can click to make those commitments and to take the theme of the UN Environment Assembly in December to heart and take it very personally. Make your commitments to beating pollution. And also to keep in mind that we do have something called the Environmental Management Group, which is a cross-UN entity that works together to try and harmonize the way that we focus on not only environment, but environment and humanitarian operations across everything that we do. And so that's another way that we can look at how the UN can be more effective in partnership and look at how we can engage more partners in making the UN a much more effective organization for you. Because after all, like the big sign says when you walk in here, it's your UN. And we do want to keep that in mind and make sure that we are, in fact, serving the world. So beat pollution, sign up, make some more commitments, and thank you very much.
So thank you, Carl, Monika, and Jesper for running the previous session. So now we have come to the final session. And this session, actually, one part of it is the evaluation, and the other part is the closure of this workshop. And that's a little bit sad in a way, because I think it's been a very kind of energizing and stimulating 2.5 days here. So, for the closing ceremony and evaluation, or for the evaluation, we have just one slide. Maybe I just move over to this one. So I think it's here. So what we're asking from you is that those of you who are online do not need to use any paper for this evaluation. You can just tap in this link on your device, whatever it is, computer or iPad or smartphone or whatever, and please fill out this survey. Those of you who have not any kind of online device that you can use, the team here have some extra paper copies. So if you want a paper copy to fill in, just raise your hand and the organizing staff will be happy to provide you with a paper copy instead. So we give you around 10 minutes to do this exercise, and then we will convene again. Thank you. So just to confirm, no one needs a paper copy. Is that correct? There's one at least, yeah, two. Okay.
Is there a price if you do it correct?
Then you have to tell me what is the correct thing.
But okay, could be that you won the right to use some CO2 pollution to come home.
I will come back to that. Okay, thank you, participants, for filling out this survey. We will now move over to the final kind of round of things for this 2.5 days. And first of all, I would like to tell to you that while you were filling out this survey, our organizer team have been walking around in the room giving you a flash drive. And on that flash drive you will find most of the documents and PowerPoints presentations that have been used during the run of this forum. And you also find the pictures from day 1. The other pictures and maybe some more documents, we will still work on the outcome and recommendations, etc., etc. That will be posted through the Environmental Emergencies Center's website, and I'm sure that all of you will receive the appropriate links to get access of these documents and photos. But now it's my pleasure to call upon Emilia to come up here beside me.
Thank you, and thanks so much also for filling in those surveys. That's very valuable for us and very, very useful as we go forward from this forum and hopefully also to a next forum in 2 years. I wanted to take the opportunity now also, while you're still here in the room, before we close, to thank everyone who has contributed to the forum, because it is, like Carl pointed out, it is a big, big team that is the support network of the joint unit. And none of this would have been possible without that network and that support. And very concretely, over the past days, there's a couple of days for some and weeks and months for others. There's some concrete persons that I want to thank very much for their dedication and their enthusiasm, and also always being very positive and making this a very positive experience also for the organizers. So first and foremost, our interns here in Nairobi who joined up as extra volunteers, Solomon, Josephat, Karina and Anne, please can you come up as well? And Thomas, can you also come up to help me? So round of applause for you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything. Thank you so much. Round of applause. They've been really, really awesome. And even when we said, no, you can go home now, it's 8 o'clock. No, it's fine. I still just need to do a couple of things. Or like, no, you have a long way to go, and you still stayed. So it's really, really amazing. And I wish you all the best also for the future, and let's stay in touch. And yeah, all the best for your future careers as well, and working on the environmental cause. Then, of course, one other intern who has been working with us for the past 3 months, and I take this opportunity now because he will unfortunately then be leaving us and continuing with his studies. And where is Anthony? There you are. So Anthony, thanks a lot. This is a person, I don't know if you had the chance to talk to him, but he has a lot of experience actually working on the ground in humanitarian settings. He came in and he helped us with a lot of the information management stuff. He's been doing a lot of the surveys and doing substantial work. A lot of these people that come in and help us, they're interns, they're unpaid, but they work on all the same tasks as we do. They often do a better job than we would do, and they're really, really amazing. So thank you, Anthony, for everything. Thank you. And then finally, yes, as well, we have one more person. There you are, Charlene. Thank you, Charlene, for all your amazing, amazing work. Charlene has been, in addition to the 4 interns I just mentioned, Charlene has been here, a dedicated capacity to work for us. You've been here now since May. and also stayed on for longer to continue helping us and to support us. This has been our staff in Nairobi doing everything, going well and beyond the forum duties, helping us on a lot of other tasks, running around, meeting people, making sure that documents get moved from one place to another. And also you got your amazing sisters choir to come and for the Green Star Awards ceremony. So thank you again for all your enthusiasm. And you're always so positive and happy. It's amazing. So thank you. Thank you so much. And then still one more, absolutely finally, Hannah, who has been coming, yes, first applause. You all know her, she has been sending you emails at all times of night. She also has been extremely dedicated. She joined us in May with the specific tasks to organize this forum as the event manager. You also have a background in this area, in this field, which has made it very, very much easier for us. We immediately picked up on all the different sessions and the actors and what to do. In addition, so taking on the substantial areas, but also taking on all of the logistics and the admin and the finances and the travel and so on. So you've been doing an amazing job, especially here now today or the last week in Nairobi. And it's a pleasure to still have you with us in the unit for some more months. Yeah, we can go forward from here. So thank you. For you, we got some. Yeah. No. So for Hannah, we got some Kenyan stuff. So a big round of applause to everyone. A really amazing team, and we've had fun as well. We even had fun like midnight last night. Yeah.
Emilia, please stay for a little while. Yeah, and Thomas, come here as well. Moritz, yeah. And Ollie. So these are the other people that have been working tirelessly on this, and I'm a little bit ashamed, again, for the second time this day, that we don't have any gifts to give them, but just to recognize that they have been working tirelessly, and they also have been promoting that this event should take place, although it has been quite, you would say, high risks that it would not pursue. And it's basically because of the staffing situation that has been in the Joint Environment Unit, where actually Thomas and Emilia are the only two officers that are working there. They have an amazing assistance by the interns and consultants like Moritz. And also they have had the champion here in Nairobi in UN Environment, Ollie. But it's still those two people who kind of consist the positions that we have in the Joint Environment Unit. So you can imagine if you read this booklet for these 2 years, how much they have accomplished with such a lean number of staff. And I think that this goes to Jesper and this goes to Mette as well. Please take care of these gold nuggets and make them stay, because if you don't do that, we will keep you accountable for that. Yeah. So thank you. We should give them, if we cannot give them any gift, I can give them one kind of gift, and that is that you're welcome to apply to the MSB field staff roster whenever you like. But we give them a big hand. Yeah? And now I have the pleasure to ask Mette to come up and say some concluding words for the end of this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, Leif. And thanks to all the rest of you in this room. Many of you who have traveled very far, on long distances, have suffered jet lag and have still been working along here till 8 o'clock in the evening, providing your input, your insight, your wisdom to this meeting to make it a really constructive and lively meeting. I've only heard good things about it, and I've been able to sort of come in and sit in the corner once in a while. But it's been fantastic to have you all here, so thank you so much for coming. I know it's not been easy just getting a visa to come into Kenya, sorting out all the travels and so on, but I hope you've had a wonderful stay here. I hope some of you will be able to stay for a few days and see what Kenya has to offer, because it has a great deal to offer. But for those who are traveling home tonight, I hope you will come again soon. It's been a real pleasure for us to host this here in Nairobi at UN Environment, at our headquarters here. We hope you've had an opportunity to also interact with some of our other colleagues who are here in the compound, not just from UN Environment, but all the other organizations that have either headquarters, regional, or country office here in Nairobi. And it's certainly been an opportunity for us to be able to get them together with you in some of the sessions that have been here today. Now, Monika beat me to it, she's very efficient, but a good message is worth repeating. Now, almost all of you were online for the survey, so do go to beatpollution.org right now, beatpollution.org, and put in your name, your email address, and tick the box that you want to live in a pollution-free planet. But not only that, if you go into the little side panel that says Act Now, you will come up with a number of ideas that you as individuals can do. Small things, but a big journey starts with a small step. So do go in, select those commitments that you can make to help us make this a pollution-free world. I understand that this will put some of you out of business, but I do think it's a good thing. So do that, do help us spread the word, make sure that you use that in your networks, and that you encourage them to join that as well. And do let us know of inspirational speakers, people that we should invite that we haven't yet been in touch with, to the United Nations Environment Assembly, which will happen the first week of December, where the whole world will come together to look at how do we beat pollution? How do we move towards a pollution-free world? So we want to hear good stories there, so if there's any of you that have good ideas, send them to meta.wilkie@unenvironment.org. It's my email address, and I'll be happy to get in touch with them. So, safe journey back. Don't forget whom you met and what you said and what you committed to over the last 2.5 days. Hope to see you all in 2 years' time. But in between that, that's where the real work starts. So good luck with it all, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much.
And now I have the pleasure to ask Jesper to say some final words as well.
Thank you very much, Leif, and thank you, Mette, very much for your closing remark. I'm a very frank person. I have chosen not to have a UN career, but a track record, so I will say some blunt things just for you to be aware. When Emilia came for the planning for 2017 and said, you have to come to this, I said, fine, you know, it'll be cancelled before then, so I committed to it. And when she came some weeks ago and reminded me, I was like, Caribbean, storms, earthquake in Mexico, big disaster in my own organization, and then the opportunity to be with a bunch of grass lovers and tree huggers and birch watchers, I was really hesitating, I have to say. And because when you're out in emergencies, the typical way the environmental issue is presented is that there's some squeaky voice coming in and saying, you know, these endangered frogs over there, you need to be careful when you're driving with your WB trucks. And you're like, go away. So I'm very, very positive surprised to be here with a group of dedicated professionals that are committed to the cause. They are living the cause. They have a willingness to share. And more importantly, a willingness to listen. And I think if we want to change the world and bring humanitarian and environment closer together, we need to do it in forums like this, but we also need to act accordingly out in emergencies and not just be a squeaky voice, but really go in and make sure that we make a difference in a way that those we are talking to understand, whether they are international response workers or local community leaders. The next message a little bit to ourselves. During the coffee break, I went up to see the exhibition, and on my way up, I stopped at the gentleman's restroom. I was standing next to the urinals, and for half of you, you know what I'm talking about, and for the other half, you can probably imagine something hanging on the wall. And next to me was a gentleman watching cartoons on his smartphone while peeing on the floor. And that's a little bit what we all are doing, unfortunately, today. We are not focused on where we are and what we are doing. We are more focused on what's going on back home, or what's going on in my office or in my organizations, or what's going on with the football results last night in the Champions League. We need to be present. If we want to make a difference, we need to be there where we are and make a difference there and work and talk to the people that we are together with. Just go on a bus with teenagers, you will realize there's no conversations on the bus, but everybody's talking to people elsewhere. This forum was a great opportunity to communicate and connect and network and commit. So that's at least some gift that Emilia and Olli and the team gets back home. It's a commitment for us. But remember to be there, be present, and make a difference. One excuse I often hear is that, yeah, we would like to do this, we'd like to make a difference, but we couldn't go there, we couldn't make it, we didn't have the funds, we didn't have the resources, etc. I really, like many of you, appreciated the presentation yesterday by the open source journalists, because they can't go there, they can't go into the war zone, they can't contribute directly on the ground, but they can make a difference off-site, but online. And I think that goes for all of us. All of you sit with knowledge and expertise that can be used somewhere else. So be willing to share and push your agenda through whatever means you have. Don't give up, even though you're working in a bureaucracy. Keep pushing and believing in it, because only then we can make a difference and bring the environment on the forefront. I work in an organization that has the mandate of coordination, and I can share with you, trust me, there is no organization that are less coordinated than my own. So I facilitate a number of global management retreats, and I keep reminding my colleagues that global coordination starts at home, so let's begin there. So if you want to make a difference, go home and make it. Only you can start the process. Don't expect anybody else to take it forward. Maybe a few, and that's my last word. I would like to thank you, Mette, and the team here from UN Environment for hosting us and providing all the infrastructure support that has enabled us to come together smoothly and work together in the last few days. And then I would like to repeat Leif's. He has said something sensible. To repeat Leif's thank you to Ole, Emilia, and the rest of the team. Thank you very much for your engagement, and safe travel home. Thank you.
So it's my turn. First of all, a message from Francois and myself. Go home and do your carbon footprint offset for your travel here. Yeah, that's the first one. Yeah. Secondly, thank you to Mette, UN Environment, for organizing this amazing workshop. Thank you, Jesper, for providing with the staff and and your dedicated time being here. It's not so often you see a person like Jesper staying in the same place for 2.5 days. So that's kind of rare, yeah. But I think that you are maybe the main focus for my short speech here. So I hope this forum has been in some way, useful for you. And if you remember the first day, I was talking about sharing, learning, networking, doing change, etc., commitment. Mette mentioned that this is a biannual thing, so next time we expect to have this kind of environmental emergencies forum in 2019. So that's 2 years from now. So I hope that what has happened during these 2.5 days has, fueled you and given you enthusiasm and commitment that you can run on until the next forum in 2 years' time. And I also kind of urge you, make use of this environmental emergencies platform, the EEC. Go there and use the online training, make use of the wealth of information that is there. Let us know what's happening with your commitments, and that you can do by logging on to LinkedIn, and there's a dedicated LinkedIn page for the EE Center as well. Go there and tell us all what you're doing. And finally, I would thank you all for being our fellow agents for change. And that concludes this 2017 Environmental Emergencies Forum. Thank you.